Okay, shall we get started? I am Sabrina Martin. I'm one of Joe's former PhD students, and I am here today to chair the panel on equality in Joe's work. I found myself really struggling to write an introduction for this theme in particular because it is such an important and pervasive theme throughout Joe's work. So I'll begin by emphasizing and being inevitably reductive about the role that relationships play in Joe's thinking on equality. And those of you who know Joe will know that he is a philosopher who truly believes what he writes, and this comes out in all of his interactions. Joe is one of the kindest, most caring, and well-liked philosophers that I've ever come across, and I think we can largely attribute that to the sincere importance he places in his belief in relationships. I believe I'm correct in saying that I was Joe's first PhD student here at Oxford. My other supervisor was leaving the university as Joe was coming in, and I asked Joe to step in and be my internal supervisor. Like any good PhD student, I had deluded myself about how long it would take me to finish, and I told Joe I'd be done in a couple months and I should be quite a low-maintenance student. Joe, in his infinite wisdom and experience, would have obviously known otherwise, who's ever heard of a low-maintenance PhD student, but he very kindly agreed to step up and supervise me anyway. So when a few months turned into over a year, Joe was very kind, patient, caring, and supportive every step along the way. Now, are you ready for my tenuous segue back to equality? So much like Joe inherited me as a PhD student, it might be said that Joe inherited his place in the egalitarian tradition from his PhD his supervisor, Jerry Cohen. But Joe has said that his heart just was not in the egalitarian debate to begin with. But Joe, we are so glad that you have entered the debate, not least because it gives us this wonderful panel here today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers who will discuss egalitarianism much more in depth. We have Laura Valentini from LMU Munich and C.M. Lim, who is an incoming lecturer in political philosophy at the University of Sheffield. Laura focuses on international justice and political methodology, and C.M. works on issues of political resistance and commemorative justice. Laura, over to you.
So, this is working. Mic is working. Oh, I was told press something, but it pressed itself. Okay, great. So, I also had not prepared a story of how I first met Joe, but, I wrote a book on convention, and the convention is being established, so I'm going to go along with it. So, I think the first time that I interacted with Joe in the form of having a brief exchange of words, I think that counts as meeting, right? Was in 2006. That was a very long time ago. And I was a doctoral student at UCL. I had just started, but I was not in the philosophy department, which is where Joe was based, but I was in the political science department. And I think Joe had probably kind of seen me around at some events around UCL, but he didn't quite know who I was. Okay. One morning, I went to the gym at University College London, and then I walked out of the gym. And you have to imagine, I don't know whether Joe remembers this, but I do. You have to imagine me, many years younger, typically I look like a mozzarella, not just because I'm Italian, because I have very, very white skin, but I just had a workout, and I was completely red like a tomato. And because I was not a very serious gym goer, I also didn't have the typical gym gear. I had gym pants and a t-shirt with a gigantic face of Elmo, the Muppet, which is also like a tomato. So basically, there was this kind of two-tomato lady walking down the street and at Tavistock Place, which is where I was staying. And there comes Joe Wolfe, coming down from Islington, I guess, probably down Tavistock, wearing rather conspicuous headphones. Could that be don't you live? Possible, okay, he's not, committing. And I saw him, and of course, PhD me at the time sort of, oh my God, that's Joe, he doesn't know who I am, so I can sort of walk around looking like a tomato with Elmo and so on, it'll be fine. And he approached me, and I was like, oh, hi, I think I've seen you several times, you said, are you a student at UCL? And then, I introduced myself, and then he was very kind of, okay, you're in the political science department. Who do you work with? Cécile Laborde. Ah, I see. Well, if you want to come, you can sort of come to some of our events as well, and so on. And that was the first, a very welcoming exchange I had with Joe. He was not too put off by the redness of the whole encounter, let's put it this way. And in fact, I think the kind of kindness and welcomingness, I'm sure it's not a word, but you know what I mean, of that first encounter continued on. He was then my PhD examiner 2 or 3 years later. Both examiners were very nice, but Joe was the more reassuring presence in the room, I will only say that. And in general, I have to say, Joe is maybe one of the people who made me feel most at home in the discipline. So there are a lot of really smart, brilliant philosophers. Joe is one of them, but I think a good proportion of them also tends to engage or indulge in the art of intellectual intimidation. And I don't think Joe ever did that, or at least I always felt comfortable whenever I was having a conversation with Joe, even when my, very junior PhD me was intimidated by the idea of Joe Wolfe, whom I hadn't met before and was famous and had written lots of books. And I think that that's a wonderful quality that Joe has, and sort of it echoes things that other people have said. Okay, so this ends the nice bit of my my talk. Okay, to the topic. So when Shai first asked me to participate in this, and I was very happy that he did, suggested I should talk about methodology. But then shortly after, he emailed me and said, oh, no, actually, there's been a change in program. Can you say something about equality? I was like, well, I can say something about equality. Then, fast forward a few months, and I'm like, oh, equality, yes. I've never worked on equality. I don't have strong views on equality. I suppose it's kind of a good thing. And then I started looking at what Joe has written on equality. So I was familiar with his work on relational egalitarianism and so on. I was like, well, but I kind of agree, it's boring. If I agree, not the work. And then I saw that he wrote a paper, the presidential address for the Aristotelian Society meeting on equality and hierarchy. And now I'm a professor in the German system. So I'm an expert on hierarchy, right? I'm basically a feudal lord. And so I said, okay, I may be qualified to do this kind of thing. And then I read to talk about this. And then I read the paper, and I did find a potential point of disagreement. And so I thought I would start with this. And so this is the subtitle. Actually, most of what I'm going to be talking about is equality and hierarchy. But I thought the subtitle would be fun. So is the British monarchy really okay? And if you're particularly interested in what the subtitle is going to be about, a kind of visual preview of what I'm going to say is this. Please, Joe, don't hate me. Okay? Okay. So let's... Helene seems surprised. Okay, let's see. So as has been mentioned by others, Joe is a relational egalitarian. And relational egalitarians start from what I take to be a fundamental moral premise, or at least that's the way that I read this. That is that human beings are fundamentally morally equal. They're each ultimate units of moral concern, so the idea of normative individualism, and they should be given, here I'm using Darwell's turn of phrase, recognition, respect. And then the job of the relational egalitarian is trying to figure out how to operationalize this in a social context. That is, how can we make it the case that society are organized such that members stand in relations of equality vis-a-vis one another, where what it takes to realize these relations of equality goes beyond just a particular distribution of socioeconomic goods, roughly speaking. But then, we look at the societies that we know, the societies in which we live, and here's a fact. Social hierarchies are ubiquitous. And they're ubiquitous, for instance, in the form of power or authority hierarchies, so parent-child relations, boss-employee relations, teacher-student relations, husband-wife, for instance, in a sexist society, general soldier, and so on and so forth. And in terms of esteem, so there are esteem hierarchies. There's a sort of the top versus not so top athlete. There's the Nobel laureate versus the regular scientists, or, the Oxford professors versus the non-Oxford professor, the virtuous person versus the non-virtuous person, etc., etc., etc. So, and the problem from the perspective of the relational egalitarian, of course, is, well, if society should reflect that moral equality, why do some get to have more power or esteem than others? Isn't that a problem? So, prima facie, there seems to be an issue. At the same time, some hierarchies seem to us justifiable, right? And so a question that arises for the relational egalitarian, which Joe addresses in the particular paper that is the focus of my remarks today, is when and why, if ever, a hierarchy justified from an egalitarian perspective. So is there kind of an egalitarian filter that we can apply, a social egalitarian filter that we can apply to hierarchies, such that we can give a green tick to the ones that are consistent with a broad relational egalitarian vision, and other ones that are not, that you should actually try to get rid of, or at least be skeptical of from a relational egalitarian perspective. Okay, this is the paper. So this is also the question that I'm going to address here. I'm going to say a few of the things that Joe says in his response, and then add a few things of my own, and then at some point tell you about the British monarchy. So, first of all, setting hierarchies of esteem aside, and this is a move that Joe also makes in his paper. So hierarchies of esteem or excellence, when fitting, that is, when they reflect true facts about people's qualities, are not per se contrary to the kind of respect that lies behind, I think, the imperative of social equality. Why is that? Because recognition, respect, I'm using Darrell's terminology, that's not the terminology Joe uses, but I think what I'm saying is kind of in the spirit of what Joe says there. He can tell me later if I'm getting it wrong. That is, the kind of respect that is owed to persons qua persons differs from what Darrell calls appraisal respect, which involves responding with praise, admiration, and the like to the display of excellence. And it seems that it's possible to have different responses in the qualities or appraisal fitting qualities that people display without thereby undermining or denying the fundamental moral equality. So, for instance, one student may be less diligent than another, but our recognition of this fact and the associated appraisal response in this respect does not imply, I think, that they're of lesser moral worth, right? And in fact, I mean, this I'm just saying something that I have an intuition that might be correct, speaking about evidence, so I'm not giving you any evidence for this. It's something that I need to think about more, but I even think that there might be something disrespectful in not giving fitting appraisal to people. So for instance, if people are being non-virtuous or morally bad, and you let them get away with it, I think there's something somewhat infantilizing about it. It's a little bit like treating them like children, because with children, it's not that you necessarily let them get away with it, but you don't have the same type of reactive attitudes because you don't think they're fully moral agents. So this is just to say that fitting esteem hierarchies as such, fitting esteem hierarchies, that's important, do not pose a problem for the relational egalitarian, or so I'm going to say. Now, what about power hierarchies, which are also the main focus of Joe's work? And I think Joe's take on power hierarchies is somewhat modest in the following sense. So as has been highlighted in the first panel today, Joe's has particular methodological commitments, that is, those of the real world or engaged political philosopher. Of course, those commitments are complex, but just for the sake of time in this brief presentation, I'm going to mention two. First, real world political philosophy takes seriously social, scientific, and psychological facts about the world. And it focuses on remedying the most pernicious obstacles to human flourishing, not on devising ideals of perfect justice. And so if we are relational egalitarians, but we also take up this particular attitude towards political philosophy, this is roughly what we should be saying about social hierarchies. And so I take it of power. And this, I think, summarizes what Joe's conclusions here are. So they are unavoidable as a matter of social fact, including not just individual hierarchies, but also group hierarchies. And this is the point where there might be some disagreement. So Joe, inspired by some remarks from Simone Weil, says, well, maybe symbolic hierarchies in particular, when not coupled with substantial powers, may be a need of the soul. They may be the sorts of things that we need to have in order to find our place in the social order or something like that. Joe looks skeptical. Maybe either I misread him or he's changed his mind, or I don't know what, but we'll see what he says later. And so, for instance, it may be that the British monarchy is an example of this. If they are a need of the soul, these kinds of social hierarchy, when they're purely symbolic, then maybe we shouldn't be too inimical to them, even as egalitarians. And then we should try to erode social hierarchies that particularly undermine the flourishing of those at the bottom, even if, on the whole, social hierarchies are an unavoidable fact of life, especially if this is feasible at reasonable costs. So, gender, race, and class hierarchies are the sorts of things where some erosion work is necessary, because those clearly significantly undermine the flourishing of those at the bottom. Okay, so what do I think? This. So, unavoidable as a matter of social fact, yes. This bit I'll come back later, not too convinced. The final point, on the other hand, is sort of, on the one hand, I agree, but my reaction to the paper was like a teeny tiny bit of disappointment, because I was expecting to be given, and maybe that was the wrong expectation. I'm not saying that you sort of misframed or did some false advertising at the beginning, but I started reading it thinking, I'm going to get the big egalitarian filter, and I'm going to have an answer to the question, these hierarchies, okay, from a kind of in principle egalitarian perspective, these hierarchies, no. And I didn't fully get that. So I got some helpful and very interesting reflections in that direction, but perhaps precisely because you want to be an engaged real-world political philosopher, maybe the whole ambition of trying to find the filter is something that you think might be somewhat misplaced, and that's a fair point. But so, Joe was being modest, and so now for the next 5 minutes, 6, or how long do I have? Yeah. I'm going to be extremely hubristic. So this is going to be Laura's hubristic take. That is, I'm going to try developing this thing from first principles to come up with a big egalitarian filter. And this is hubristic for many reasons. Because I'm not an expert on the literature on social equality. I mean, I've had some exposure to it, but I've not worked on it. B, I'm aware of the fact that especially in recent years, there has been a whole industry on writings on hierarchies, and what I'm going to say is not going to be based on that. So from a scholarly perspective, I'm being extremely hubristic. But nonetheless, I thought, why not? I'm going to try it out. One spoiler, despite all my hubris, I'm also going to be not very original, because I think Rolf said it already, which is not something I think I say often, but in this particular case, it kind of applies. So you'll see what I have to say here. So I think, well, let's think about, the question is, how can we make a social hierarchy consistent with respect for persons as equals? And it seems to me that, well, to check whether hierarchies are compatible with persons' equal status, we need to ask whether they can be justified to them as equals, a sort of pretty Rawlsian thought. And here comes another kind of Rawls-ish thought. Plausibly, those at the top won't have much of a complaint. As it happened, I'm not too confident in this, what I've just said, but I'll just leave it there. I think sometimes they might as well. But the issue is whether those at the bottom do. And if they do not, then the hierarchy is justified from an egalitarian perspective. So this is a sort of thought that lies behind something like the difference principle. And so think about a Rawlsian difference principle, but applied to power hierarchies rather than to the distribution of socioeconomic goods. And so this is the first principle. A power hierarchy is justified from an egalitarian perspective if it is in the best interest of those at the bottom compared to an egalitarian alternative. And I think this is kind of difference principle inspired. That's why I say Rawls has said it already. And so which hierarchies seem to fit this principle that strike me as, broadly speaking, not anti-egalitarian? Parents-children hierarchies or teacher-students. So I'm not saying that any particular one is justified. I mean, there may be ways of designing the hierarchies that are terrible, where parents have way too much power or teachers have way too much power. But the idea is that, if we organize the relationship between parents and children or teachers and students in an egalitarian way, are the students and the parents, are the students and the children better off than they would be under a suitably constrained hierarchical relationship? And I think the answer is no. I think they're better off if the relationship is hierarchical. So yes, compatible with equality. Lauda's hubristic take 2. This is not enough. Why is it not enough? Because we can't make this kind of claim in relation to all of the hierarchies that strike us as in principle justified, I take it. So some such hierarchies will pass this first test. So they will be such that those at the bottom are better off because there is a hierarchical relationship compared to an egalitarian one, but not for others. So some hierarchies are not in the best interest of those at the bottom, and yet they seem necessary. And again, this is something that Joe acknowledges. And these are the sort of functional hierarchies that are necessary for coordination, for efficiency. Sometimes we need to have people in positions of leadership, let's put it this way. And so what do we say in this case? And this is also a thought that, I broadly attribute it to roles, but Tim Scanlon has also discussed this. So everyone benefits from these kinds of functional hierarchies, and provided everyone had a fair, equal chance to land at the top, the hierarchy is not subject to an egalitarian complaint. It is compatible with treatment as equals. It doesn't treat those who are at the bottom as inferiors because, if that's, how come that, I'm not the boss, I'm just, say, an employee? Well, we need, all of us, for society as a whole, we need to have a system where there are some bosses and there are some employees, of course, with appropriate constraints and protections. Even you are better off in that kind of society than a society where everything is completely flat. That is the assumption. And you have just as good a chance as everyone else to land in that kind of position. So you're not being treated as inferior because there is this kind of hierarchy. So here's P2. A power hierarchy is justified from an egalitarian perspective if its presence is more beneficial for everyone than its absence. And of course, this is a complicated empirical / axiological question because one needs to figure out what exactly is beneficial. But I'm assuming that some hierarchies will meet a proper interpretation of this point 1. Power differentials are kept to a minimum compatibly with obtaining the relevant benefits. So the idea is not that, any kind of power differential goes. And then the distribution of places in the hierarchy is consistent with something like fair equality of opportunity. So that's the second Rawlsian thought. Okay, so example, boss-employee relations. A couple of remarks. So the 2 principles that I've set out, of course, I don't know whether these are fully comprehensive, but they seem like a decent starting point. A proposed basis for an egalitarian justification of hierarchies, but of course, other considerations may have to be factored in for hierarchies to be justified overall. So I'm taking equality to be one concern, but not the only concern. So I'm not saying that, if the filter is met, then yay, the hierarchies are fine. But it's an important filter, especially if you're an egalitarian. Still, P1 and P2 seem pretty plausible to me, but as I said, I've not done full due diligence, so I may be proven wrong, and appear consistent with some of our intuitive egalitarian unease about hierarchies. So parent-child, teacher-student, boss-employee with employee protection, good, or at least I don't regard them as outrageous. Sexist, racist class hierarchies, clearly bad, and they don't meet any of these constraints, right? So back to Joe and the monarchy. So it looks like in the end, Joe and I land in pretty similar positions. That is, I also think that sexism, racism, and classism is bad. Though maybe I think that this is a bit too bombastic the way I put it on the slide. But anyway, I've tried to kind of offer a deeper egalitarian explanation for why those positions are correct. In a way, I just wanted more of the egalitarian story, let's put it this way. And I've tried to sort of cook up one as a result. So I wonder what Joe thinks about it. Of course, this is only, a 10-minute, very quick summary. There's a lot more than one could say. But going back to the Simone Weil inspired point. So there is one aspect where Joe and I potentially differ. Joe is sympathetic. I mean, I thought you were sympathetic. Maybe you were not sympathetic. Anyway, to Weil's point that hierarchy may be a need of the soul, such that if not coupled with significant power, the type of symbolic hierarchy exemplified by the British monarchy may actually be okay. And I don't see it. So I'm skeptical that esteem or privilege, I guess if it's not coupled with a great deal of power, I'm also not quite sure how little power the British monarchy has. But if it's just esteem or privilege, as I'm speaking, I'm worried that I won't be allowed into the country again in the future, but hopefully not. I'm skeptical that esteem and privilege hierarchies that do not track appraisal relevant qualities are justified. So for me, it's important what was said before about esteem hierarchies when they're fitting, are not contrary to the egalitarian impetus, but if they're not fitting, and in this case doesn't seem very fitting, I guess, then they're not justified, basically. Of course, and this, I take it as a point that Joe would agree with, whether we should get rid of hierarchies that may not pass the egalitarian filter once they are there is a different question, in the sense that trying to get rid of them may be extremely difficult, it may be extremely costly, it may backfire. I mean, what we then do in practice with them, once we have given our moral evaluation, is a different question. So I'm not going to say, abolish the British monarchy. That's not what I'm saying. So contrary to Joe, possibly, I do not for a minute worry that the disappearance of the British monarchy would leave a big hole in the egalitarian soul. Thank you.
To see it.
Okay, thank you. I don't have slides, so you have to listen to me for the next 25 minutes. Okay, hi everyone, and thanks to Shai and the team and everyone who helped to organize the event and for inviting me to speak. I'm very honored to be here to celebrate Joe's work. I was supervised by Joe for my MPhil at UCL and then for my DPhil at Oxford. And as Shai mentioned at the start of the day, one recurring and I think for me especially memorable feature of our meetings was Joe kind of telling personal stories when we met, right? So about kind of people he knew, places he's visited, events he attended, and so on. And all of which I think eventually and unfailingly would turn out to be relevant kind of to the philosophical problems that we were talking about. So what might at first sight come across as a kind of off-topic story eventually became something quite salient. And I think this is kind of deeply indicative of what we might want to think of as Joe's philosophical orientation. That is, kind of he begins by attending very closely to the real world before going on to uncover or excavate, as it were, the philosophical and political problems that attach to these issues. And then, furthermore, to show us that these cases, these stories, these problems, they reveal some serious issues with the theories, the philosophical theories that we come to accept or we find ourselves accepting, and so on. So this I take to be very distinctive, again, of Joe's orientation, to first let the world speak, and then to let it guide or regulate our philosophical theorizing. So here's a revealing moment, and this is kind of unrelated, as it were. So my MPhil thesis explored the justificatory basis of public reason liberalism. This was supervised by Joe at UCL. My initial thought when I got to Oxford was to continue this work in some form, but sometime in the first year of my DPhil, and this was a time where I think anti-racist protests were going on throughout the world, I told Joe that I didn't want to work on public reason liberalism anymore. And instead, I wanted to think a little bit more about protests, and Joe's response was something along the lines of, wow, thank God. And then he added that he thought that my previous work was a bit dry, wasn't it? So anyway, we see that it's not just talk for Joe when he says that we should do real-world political philosophy or engaged philosophy. This is something that I think guides very very mundane interactions with him, and down to kind of the choices of topics that he finds interesting, salient, important, and so on. And like many of you in the room today, I think I found a lot of inspiration in this orientation, both towards the world and towards theorizing, especially in moments where you get caught up in the arguments and you're like, oh, why the hell am I doing this? I think it's helpful to think that, okay, this is something that I'm doing. I'm trying to think a little bit more deeply about the world. So I'm going to try and do something similar today, to think a la Wolf, as it were. And so, like Joe, I begin with a story, a personal story. Now, consider, in our minds, a public institution, and I won't name names. A public institution puts in a place for its employees to obtain stationery and other office equipment for their work. So this process goes as follows. An employee can make a request for stationery by completing and submitting a form. This form is then reviewed by the manager, who approves or rejects the request depending on their judgment about whether said employee requires the stationery for their work and how many instances of such stationery they require. If the request is approved by the manager, the employee must proceed to amend stationery department in the institution with their identification and approved form to collect exactly the amount of stationery that was approved. In addition, the approval and distribution of stationery is monitored and audited and subject to regular audit. So again, I want to stress this is not a hypothetical story. More details later on during the break when it's not being recorded, of course. Now, two features of this example are salient. First, the process in concern secures the value of fiscal integrity to an extremely high degree. Right? So fiscal integrity, on a very crude characterization, concerns the integrity with which financial matters are dealt with. Right? So it's kind of general. While there are many constituents of fiscal integrity, the chief condition, it appears to me, concerns whether the processes are such that they ensure the proper spending of and accounting for institutional funds. Among other things, an institution is fiscally integrous or virtuous if it has processes put in place that prevent people from spending money wantonly or siphoning money for their personal use, or more generally, for purposes, kind of using institutional funds for purposes that are not authorized by the institution or not otherwise in line with the goals of the institution. That is, a fiscally virtuous institution has processes that prevent waste and corruption, and ideally also processes that can detect and rectify waste and corruption. So this is admittedly very general and somewhat vaguely stated, but I think most people recognize misuse of institutional funds when they see it, right? So whether it takes the form of maybe decking the workplace with fancy furniture, or allowing employees certain kinds of luxuries that are unrelated to their work, letting your dean take first-class travel, stuff like that. We recognize it when we see it. So concerns of fiscal integrity then are understandably, I hope you recognize, they're understandably heightened when the institutions in concern are public. That is, when they receive public funds to do public work. Given that public funds are standardly drawn from taxation, we must ensure that there's neither waste nor corruption as part of a project of being accountable to those citizens from whom these funds have been taken. And furthermore, given that public funds that are allocated to any given institution, public institution, are funds that could have been redirected elsewhere, so allocated elsewhere, including to address fundamental and urgent needs, public institutions are especially pressed to ensure that their use of public funds are in line with the justification for allocating those funds to them in the first place. So we can take it then that as an uncontroversial fact that fiscal integrity is an important institutional virtue, and that institutions, especially public institutions, should attempt to be as fiscally virtuous as they can. So this is the first feature, right? That the process in concern is highly fiscally virtuous. Returning to the story, however, returning to the story first, we see that the process in concern rules out waste and corruption, I think, or at least it minimizes it to a very large extent. But here's the second feature about this process. And I guess, you share my intuition that something here is arguably insane, right? At the very least, and this is a hope, I think, that I hope you share with me, we have the intuition that something has gone wrong here, right? That there's something at least problematic, so to speak, about the process. The challenge then is to articulate why this is so. So as part of this task, let me set aside a couple of candidate accounts of what is problematic about this process before kind of bringing in Joe's work to try to resolve part of the problem. So the first account centers on the impact of the process on the institution. So this account begins with the very plausible observation that neither public institutions nor their employees are fiscal integrity maximizing entities, right? So instead, and in the spirit of Isaiah Berlin, they have a plurality of aims beyond securing fiscal integrity. And the pursuit of these other aims might be frustrated, to say the very least, if the time and energies of employees are squandered on processes seeking to maximize fiscal integrity. Call this the distraction account. So part of Joe's work in trying to get us to recognize a plurality of institutional virtues and institutional values can support this point. I think this account certainly explains what is problematic with the process, part of it at least. However, it falters in circumstances where the process doesn't actually take up much time or doesn't actually take up much energy. So some easy modifications to the process illustrate the point. Suppose an electronic system is put in place which automatically completes the required form for an employee when the employee logs in to the electronics system. And then it fills it up. It fills up the form with a projected quantity of stationery that employees like them standardly or regularly use, so kind of the amounts of stationery that they regularly use, which is relevant to or required for their work. All the employee has to do then is to check if the amount is correct and acceptable to them, and then to click OK. Similar adjustments can then, I think, probably be made to the approval and collection process, which can then vastly reduce the amount of time and energy that needs to be spent on the process. So with these modifications in place, it may take applicants something no more than a couple minutes, a month to go through the whole process to collect their stationery for the month. But if we think that that is still insane, then it means that appeals to distraction don't settle for us what we think is problematic or what is potentially problematic about a process like this. So then we kind of think about something else, right? So a second account of the problem with the process is that it imposes disproportionate checks relative to the costs involved in waste and corruption. According to this account, there is nothing problematic with the process per se. What is problematic is instead the issue to which the process is applied. Right? So it seems that the costs involved in waste and corruption pertaining to office stationery are so marginal that they don't need to be regulated by the process at hand, which impose disproportionate burdens on employees. Right? So there's a sense that there is no number of markers that you can take, whiteboard markers that you can take, that will result in waste or corruption that we need to take into account. Right? You just kind of wave it off, as it were. Call this the disproportionality account. I found this account more promising than the former in terms of its potential to account for the problem with this kind of process beyond its narrow application to issues of stationery. Nonetheless, two features of the account are, I think, noteworthy. One is that concerns about disproportionality appear to vary in accordance with concerns about distraction. That is, if the processes involved are so streamlined and so efficient that they don't even pose the slightest threat or distraction from the pursuit of other institutional goals, then the charge of proportionality appears to be accordingly deflated. The other kind of noteworthy feature of the account is that the determination of disproportionality cannot be made by simply comparing the costs saved by avoiding this or that specific instance of waste or corruption pertaining to stationery to the burdens incurred by this or that particular employee. Instead, the determination must also take into account the total costs saved by avoiding waste and corruption, as well as the good that could have been secured or the evil that could have been averted if the funds were put to better use elsewhere. So that is to say, while there may be no number of markers that I can take that would make a dent in the public funds, collectively, maybe if the whole BSG, all the employees started collecting markers for personal use, at some point we might think, that there is some problem going on here. And once these, I think, once these considerations enter the picture, then it becomes less clear that the worry about disproportionality has very much traction in accounting for the problem with the process at hand. I think these two accounts do explain the problem, again, with many actual fiscally virtuous processes, but I want to consider a problem that seems to me to remain when worries about distraction and worries about disproportionality are absent or muted, and this is where I think Zhou's work very helpfully enters the picture. So in his 1998 paper in Philosophy in Public Affairs, I think, Fairness, Respect, and the Egalitarian Ethos, Zhou examines the problem with conceptions of equality that center on people's opportunities to acquire resources as part of an attempt to articulate distributive principles that are exploitation-proof. So the example here is that a serfer who chooses not to work has no claim on other citizens to redistribute resources in such a way as to subsidize or support the serfer's life plans. But to make such a differentiation, we need, as Zhou says, and I quote, a great deal of knowledge of individual circumstances, end quote. This requires us to then put in place some processes that can obtain and verify such knowledge of people who make welfare claims. So one of Zhou's concerns here about these processes is that they can convey, and they often do convey, our distrust of welfare claimants. Right? Specifically, they indicate a suspicion that these claimants may be trying to gain some unwarranted advantage for themselves and that they would cheat the system if only they could get away with it. Zhou argues that, and I quote, individuals regularly treated in these ways can reasonably believe that they have low respect standing, end quote. That is, they can reasonably believe that they don't enjoy the respect of others as equals in society. So I think Zhou's argument here provides us with a very helpful starting point for thinking about the process of requesting stationery. Specifically, so this is quite a trivial example, of course, but we shall try and scale it up, I promise, in a bit. Specifically, it helps us to see that the checks that are built into the process can convey and indeed presuppose the idea that employees are objects of suspicion. Right? So in our case, the suspicion can but need not be undergirded by the thought that employees would cheat the system if only they could get away with it. It can also be undergirded, of course, by the thought that employees could unintentionally waste public funds, whether by accident or through their stupidity, if they were not subject to these kinds of checks. That is, the process treats employees as potential exploiters or potential squanderers of public funds. Now, this is the first part. We run into a difficulty, however, in extending Zhou's claims about the impact of such distrust on welfare claimants to the case of public employees. That is, I think it's unclear or less clear that the distrust that is conveyed by the process of requesting for stationery can support public employees' reasonable beliefs that they have low respect standing. That is, that they don't enjoy the respect of others in society. Moreover, to claim otherwise appears to run the risk of exaggeration. I think a potential solution is implicit in Zhou's paper, where he says very briefly in a sentence, and I quote, that if you don't trust them, here referring to other people, if you don't trust them in areas which you would hope to be trusted yourself, then you do not respect them as an equal. So this kind of, we move from a causal claim to something more akin to a constitutive claim. Well, I don't think that this claim holds for all kinds of hopes, because I can hope for really insane things as well. It appears plausible in the context of cooperative relationships, such as those between citizens who are equal co-producers and therefore equal co-beneficiaries of the social good or of some specific social good. That is, the claim seems to me more plausible when the areas in which we hope to be trusted are areas in which our performance in those areas, areas in which our performance depends on features of ourselves, such as our capacities or commitments, that ground our status as equals. So kind of putting a Rawlsian gloss on this claim clarifies the point. Specifically, we can say that this kind of distrust, which concerns people's relation to the social good, indicates that these people are not those with whom we can cooperate as equal co-producers of the social good. So by distrusting them, we call into question their capacities or their commitments to co-produce the social good, or outrightly treat them as lacking such capacities or lacking such commitments. That is to say, we do not treat them as equal cooperating members of society. These people and their potential drain on the social good must therefore be carefully managed by putting in place the kinds of processes that we have been considering. With this, we can return to the case at hand of public employees and stationery. In this case, the distrust can call into question, I think, and again building on Joe's work, can call into question their relation to the social good, albeit in a somewhat mediated way, through the public funds that are allocated to the public institutions and the resources that are bought using those public funds in order to support the work that public employees do. So when we distrust employees in the way that I've been discussing, we can convey that they don't stand as equals to us in relation to the social good, albeit, again, mediated, in quite a mediated sense. As I briefly mentioned, again, at the start of this talk, the concern with fiscal integrity is something like a stalking horse. We see that the problem of distrust and not treating others as equals is not contained to processes that concern things like stationery, right? It's not even contained, I think, to processes pertaining to fiscal integrity. Instead, it can manifest in other areas. In recognizing this, we see that the problem of distrust and not treating others as equals don't simply reside at the level of this or that particular process or in this or that particular area of work. Employees are typically and at any time subject to a plurality of these processes. So even if we can and they can shrug off the manners in which they are treated by some specific process, they may not be able to do so when we consider the totality of the processes to which they are subject. To quickly sum up, I think the discussions so far allow us to bolster some recent discussions of workplace democracy which have tended to focus on the arbitrary and sometimes unlimited exercises of power that managers have over their subordinates. One important argument, again, in this literature is that such power cannot be justified with reference to the goals of the institutions, right? So the idea that a manager exercises power over their subordinates, but that power cannot be justified with reference to the goals of the institution. Our discussions here, I hope, suggest that even if the processes to which employees are subject can be justified with reference to institutional goals, and even if they can be justified with reference to publicly endorsable goals, there can nonetheless be worries about equality. Of course, I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that these worries about equality give us conclusive reasons to give up checks and balances in public service and public institutions and in bureaucracies. Because these processes do secure for us, I think, important goods. My claim is merely that given their impact on equality, the impact of these processes on equality, we have some reason to reconsider putting them in place if we can avoid it. As Joe argued in 1998 and has reminded us of it repeatedly across the decades, sometimes we have reason to limit our pursuit of what we take to be incredibly weighty virtues like justice or fairness in order to honor the egalitarian ethos and to get closer to realizing a society of equals. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers, and I think we will now open the floor for questions. We'll start back here. Could you please say your name as well when the microphone comes to you? I'm sorry, I don't know as many names as Johan did in the last.
Andrea Giovanni, KCL, philosophy.
I do know who you are.
So it's a question for Laura. Laura, fantastic talk as always. So I wonder whether you just let esteem hierarchies off the hook
too quickly.
quickly. Sorry. So I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about, classic kind of critiques of meritocracy. So, I mean, the problem is if you allow esteem hierarchies, right, there's a sense in which what goes with esteem is also prestige. There's honor. And with all those judgments of someone who is esteemed, praised for their high skills, you know, there's some sense that this is someone who contributes to society, right? This is someone who is valuable, which you don't have in an aristocracy. Monarchies, right? You know, they're useless. I mean, the aristocrats are useless. Everyone knows that. So this is an important difference, right? So what if we're talking about justification to the worst off? How is this going to look, right? How's this going to look to the worst off? Oh, you know, we realize you have no talent. We realize you really don't contribute much of value to this society. So, you know, sorry, this is an esteem hierarchy, and this is fully justified to you because overall you're going to be better off with this inequality of consideration and esteem. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more. So it seems to me those kind of cases, the distinction between recognition respect and appraisal respect totally breaks down.
Okay, good. Thanks, Andrea. So the way that I've tried to secure what I was saying against this kind of objection, but I realize it's a little bit of a cop-out, is by saying fitting. So I think I spoke about fitting esteem or fitting appraisal. And of course, what counts as fitting is a big question, and I don't have a fully worked out theory. Well, not even a half worked out theory, if I have to be completely honest. So what I was thinking of, for instance, you talked about the problems with meritocracy. For instance, one issue is how do we even define merit? So what counts as merit in a particular context? What are the properties that, or qualities that attract a fitting kind of appraisal? And I don't have a full story for this, but I'm fairly confident that there are certain qualities that are fitting objects of certain kinds of appraisals, instances of human excellence and so on. And I do think that, you know, we would lose something, possibly even from an egalitarian perspective. That is the thought that I said, you know, it's an intuition, I don't have evidence for this. But if we don't give people esteem or appraisal for the particular qualities that they display, assuming that these are appraisal or esteem worthy, I think we are in some sense wronging them as agents in a way that percolates. So I'm going the opposite direction into almost recognition respect, because we're not just kind of agents in the abstract, but we're the particular creatures that we are who use our agents in a particular way. I mean, the kind of picture that you're painting, oh, you know, you have no talent, you contribute nothing of value, that seems to be the sort of thing that you get maybe in the society that allocate both power and esteem in a way that doesn't seem to be justified. So let's put it this way. I'm hopeful that if the fittingness constraint is A, properly spelled out theoretically, and also sort of adhered to in practice, so esteem is really being given when it's fitting, then we shouldn't find ourselves in the kind of situations that you offer. So, you know, someone says, oh, sorry, you have absolutely no talent whatsoever. Well, I'm not sure what person, you know, I'm thinking that someone who is just cleaning windows is someone who is doing something valuable and should be regarded as such. So, I mean, I don't know the particular case that you have in mind. It seems, I'm speaking too long. But another thing is, I worry that in the real world, it's going to be difficult, and this is a point that Joe makes in the paper, for there not to be sort of spillover effects between esteem and power. So people who are, so maybe that's the worry that you have. Maybe that's what you were getting at. You know, you're giving esteem, and then you know, there's kind of a currency conversion, and it turns into power, and the power is actually not fitting, only the esteem is fitting. And how exactly we can socially engineer something that avoids the spillover, I'm not quite sure. So if you're worried about the spillover, I'm also worried about the spillover. Yeah, but so worries in the real world, but conceptually, I do think that if we can avoid the spillovers and we really allocate esteem in a way that is fitting, then some of your main concerns we should be able to address. But yeah.
We had, let's see, question here with the man with the beard, and then we'll start with you.
This is another question for Laura. A wonderful talk. Both your premises pay attention to whether those at the bottom of a social hierarchy, say employees with a boss, are benefiting from the social hierarchy in a sense that in a less hierarchical world they would fare worse. But you mentioned earlier today that you like the non-identity problem, and think about it.
God, what did I do?
Put in perspective, if we had non-hierarchical arrangements going on for some decades, different people would meet, different people would have sex at different times, and different people would be born. So almost every, and different, even if they're born to this nice life, they might be unemployed instead of working in any company. The bulk of people actually usually in that way benefit from hierarchical, broad social arrangements.
I'm completely lost. I have to apologize.
Right.
So yes, if we are in a non-hierarchical society, different people would be born.
After a few decades,
yes.
you've changed a lot of things in society. Yeah,
yeah, sure. Okay,
so
good.
Agree. You know the non-identity problem, right?
Yes.
So different people would be born. So the people who are now working in this very hierarchical workplace, but have an okay life, may well, in all probability, somebody else would have been born instead.
In the if things had been different in the past, the people who are now, no.
You're right to grill me a bit on this, but I think I'm imagining we have a few decades of more hierarchical social arrangements. Less hierarchical social arrangements.
Less.
Correct. More egalitarian, more social egalitarian social arrangements, and different people get to work in workplaces and be born in the first place.
Yeah.
So we all, in that sense, or a lot of people are benefiting in that way from not being in a more egalitarian society.
Why are they benefiting? Sorry, I'm missing this. They wouldn't be born.
Correct.
So how are they benefiting?
Because their life is good overall.
Oh,
so
compared to not being born in the first place.
Classical non-identity problem. Correct.
But I thought that if you like the non-identity problem, you can't make these kinds of claims.
So tell me in a minute why I can't, but I'll just kind of finish. If this holds, then your premises force you to approve social hierarchies much more than I suspect you want to approve of them.
I'll say one super quick thing. I'm sorry for all the back and forth. I think I'm skeptical about the assumption that just because had things been, if I understood the question correctly, but if not, then during the coffee break, if the world had been less hierarchical in the past, then I would not have been born. So the fact that the world was more hierarchical in the past and continues to be hierarchical even if I'm at the bottom, still is good for me because I'm born. And the thing is that if you think that there's something to the non-identity problem, then I think that it's good for me is difficult to say because in the counterfactual, I wasn't there in the first place. So I don't know that it's good for me, rather like that it's benefited me because compared to what baseline? To the bit where I don't exist? I don't know how to compare non-existence with existence. I think I would say that.
Great, thank you. We've had the man in the red tie here had a question. Oh, sorry. Joe also has a question. So maybe we can take these two questions together. And I do. No. Don't. No.
This one's going to be for.
Chairing's really stressful as well.
This one's going to be for CJ.
Great, good.
I was interested to hear more from you about when, as it were, taking stationery to use at home, for example, counts as dishonest. And it seems that there are loads of cases. I was thinking about the MP's expenses scandal that happened about 15 years or so ago. We realised that the effect of not monitoring this, it turns out MPs think it's kind of reasonable to build sort of building a duck house at public expense or kind of have their moat cleaned out. And so that there seems to be obvious problems from the other way around, where you realise to be working in any kind of public service is to have to take that sort of public service to be core to what you do. And part of that is an importance of honesty. So I wondered almost sort of how you think, well, what are the best ways to ensure that or create the right kind of incentives if it doesn't involve, as it were, sort of filling out forms in triplicate?
Yeah, thanks for this. I think, and again, drawing from Joel's work, I think standardly we think that, you know, these checks and balances are good. We shouldn't abolish them. So you're absolutely right. We don't want to kind of move from, you know, taking a pen home and using it to write to kind of building, you know, holiday homes at the public taxpayers' expense. So we might think that we want to set a threshold of severity above which, I guess the cost above which, then it is unproblematic for us to impose certain kinds of checks. And then below which, if the costs are kind of trivial, we kind of just shrug it off, let them take markers and you know, erasers back home. But I think the lesson that I take to be in Joel's work is that it is mistaken for us to think that because we have decided on this threshold as the right point where we make the trade-offs, that there are therefore no more trade-offs, or that we did not make some trade-off in arriving there, right? So I think Joe want to say, and I agree, that even if we say, okay, yeah, these markers are like, you know, 50 pence a piece, and we just let them take it home if they want, we are implicitly trading off some value against another. And I think that's just the basic thing I want to say, right? That there are these trade-offs, and we are prepared to make these trade-offs, and this gives us some reason to rethink what we take to be, you know, maybe something like our lexicographically prior commitments to equality or fairness, so to fairness or justice or the like. Yeah.
Over to Joe.
Okay, Laura, so I think I want to reassure everyone here that I didn't set out to write a paper defending the British monarchy on an egalitarian basis, but
you heard it here. Joe loves Camilla. That was what we saw.
I was very amused to find Simone Weil, of all people, defending the British monarchy, so I thought I should include that in the paper. No, so the motivation of the paper really came out of having done work on the social determinants of health, and the observation from people like Michael Marmot that you know, human beings are primates, and all primates organize themselves in hierarchical groups. And then reading more work of this type, Jim Sidanius's social dominance theory, where he argues or claims on extensive empirical basis that there never has been a non-hierarchical human society except those that have tried it and then have destroyed themselves, right? And so for a relational egalitarian, this is very depressing, because from the egalitarian perspective, there should be no social hierarchies. Individual hierarchies or role hierarchies may be, but I'm interested in this problem that other egalitarians don't seem to be very interested in, which is a problem of social hierarchy, where one group is given precedence over another, not because of the features of the individuals in that group, but for whatever reason it is. So Sidanius and others have argued that, if I remember it correctly, all societies, and this is incredibly depressing, have organized themselves around three things: age, gender, and some arbitrary other thing, which could be religion, could be birth, could be something. And if you try to get rid of them, you destroy society. So then the challenge is, how can you continue to be as much of a relational egalitarian as you can while respecting the facts that you would rather were not facts about human psychology or human group psychology? And so the idea then that comes out of Simone Weil is, well, let's have some hierarchies that are nothing but the hierarchy. And this is what her view of the British monarchy is. So what she's contrasting that is maybe the French monarchy, as it was before the revolution, where the kings had real power. So if you have a hierarchy associated with power, you've got a real problem. If you have hierarchy and no power, maybe that's... But I knew that any type of defense of the British monarchy was going to get some response at some point, and this might be the time when it anyway, I just wanted to put it in the context.
Thanks. There's the man here has been waiting.
So I'm a bit disappointed because I thought someone finally caught up on Joe being a monarchist. So Joe basically already covered what I was about to ask, but I was about to say that I didn't quite see why, from your proposed framework, we should oppose the British monarchy at all. So it seems like first, as Joe said, and follow the Weil point, it's symbolic, so it doesn't hold any power. So actually, the two filters that you suggest don't really apply to it, right? If I understood correctly, those filters apply to power hierarchies. And then it's a kind of an esteem hierarchy, so we just afford to them recognition that they don't deserve. So we're wronging the monarchist, we're wronging King Charles, we're infantilizing him. Sure, why not? If it serves a social function, if it serves a proper social function, I guess that's a price I'm happy to pay, and maybe other people are willing to pay. So maybe you can say more of why the framework you presented tells us something that's wrong about the British monarchy, if it actually does serve this kind of social function that a lot of British people seem to think that it does.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now I've got to get worried because, I was trying to sort of tell him you're being too positive on the monarchy, but it turns out that maybe I am. So two things. One is just a kind of boring empirical point. I don't know to what extent they really don't have power. In the sense that, it also depends on what kind of power one has in mind. But I get the sense that, they do have some amount of power. They may not sort of fully control the country, but they certainly have more, what the king says has more power than what I say, for instance. So, and this goes back maybe a little bit to Andrea's point, that is, it's difficult to completely disentangle or separate esteem from power. There are concerns about spillover, and I think in the British monarchy case, it's clear. So I don't think that the principles about the power hierarchies are completely irrelevant in that case, because there's some of that. But in relation to esteem, so I suggested that, esteem hierarchies are okay for an egalitarian perspective when they're fitting. Now you're telling me, okay, but if they're not, if merit or the esteem, admiration, whatever is being given to someone who doesn't deserve it, where does the complaint come from, right? So I have two thoughts about this. The first is, okay, I don't know that the monarchy is infantilized. I'm not sure that that is the right complaint. But I do worry about the fact that we may be, I don't have a fully fledged out theory of this, as I guess you've probably noticed. This is not like part of a magnum opus or anything like that. Just I'm pontificating about stuff that I've not thought nearly enough about. But that even the ones who are at the top, but are at the top for the wrong reasons in some kind of hierarchies, might be wronged and or harmed because of that. I don't have a full story, but I don't find the point implausible. And B, there is a sense of unfairness, right? How can you justify to others that they're still being treated as equals if you're getting advantages of esteem that are not fitting? So there still seems to be some kind of egalitarian-ish concern. But you're right that I didn't say anything about it, and what I said now is just very gestural. So.
Great. We've got a question over here, and I think maybe, might have time for one more if it's.
Thank you. Cal Calwold, University of Leeds. My question is also for Laura. So maybe I'll defend the British monarchy and its good influence on the egalitarian. So I guess there are certain functions of the state, right, that go with being head of state. Like their pictures are in public buildings. Everybody has to stand up when they come in the room. Soldiers salute them. They accredit ambassadors and so on, which, coming from the US, it's a little bit annoying that you always have to see, perhaps, for half the country, the face of someone who's defeated you or the head of some partisan. And then you're like, oh, they're having a military parade. Is this democratic backsliding? And so there's this element of, it's fine for majorities to pick the people who rule us, but I don't want the majorities to pick the people I give all this esteem to that comes with these kinds of, they throw banquets. Whereas, you see a picture of the king, you're like, or like there's trooping of the colors and so on. It's fine. Like nobody, this mechanism is, there could be other better ones. Maybe we randomly select one, but it's fine. We all govern each other. We choose how we live together, but these kinds of things that necessarily have to go, that's just some guy, that's just some random birth order, right? So why isn't that a kind of a modeling of certain kind of egalitarianism?
So I'm not sure, but I think my gut reaction is to say, let's have a banquet in honor of Joe, because, within a certain type of, I think there's fitting esteem that is being in this particular case. And, I guess some of it, oh God, this is getting hierarchical. This is Oxford, which is also kind of hierarchical in and of itself. I'm getting entangled in different hierarchies. But the suggestion is, it seems to me that if there is a need for a certain kind of, hierarchical structure in life that doesn't have to do with power, but has to do with esteem, with symbol, with ceremonies. Someone mentioned that it's not obvious to me that necessarily the monarchy fulfills that. It seems that you can still have those kind of social events and phenomena in a way that tracks something that seems to be more sort of morally or axiologically fitting. And so while I can see that maybe, picture of the king was the implicit comparison picture of Trump, right? Okay, right? But maybe, I also venture, maybe nobody's picture, to some extent, could also not be that bad of a thing, or maybe a picture of someone, who distinguished themselves centuries ago, where there's more of a distance. But still, banquet for Joe, banquet for the wedding, banquet for the Nobel laureate, the surgeon who cured whoever. And that seems to still take care of a lot of the stuff that you were referring to. And so I think that's even better from an egalitarian.
We've got 3 minutes. Does anyone have a really quick question about office stealing office? Perfect. Real quick, 3-minute question.
Thank you. So my question for Zhongming is, so obviously I share the same distaste for bureaucracy, but on your point about respect and trust, certainly it appears to be, optically, is bad for, it seems to be disrespecting certain employees. But let's say consider the case where every level of your company is subject to this same process. So even the CEO or the intern, they all have to go through this procurement process. Then one could argue that this is just a case of placing controls and imposing institutional values where you can't trust anybody. No one is capable of representing the plurality of institutional values. You're just using processes to represent those institutional values and guide the institution to go in a certain direction.
Right. Thanks. I want to say something akin to Laura. This, as you might have guessed, is not part of a bigger project. I invented these thoughts on the fly. So that was one thing I thought of, and I've got 2 responses to this. One is that I think the fact that everyone is subject, or supposed to be subject everyone to it, I think doesn't quite take away the sting of disrespect. I think then it's just located elsewhere. Maybe it becomes like, the electorate thinks that public officials are idiots and can't be trusted. I think that still conveys something about people's attitudes towards these people, right? That they are not trustworthy as co-producers of the social good, or at least that they cannot be trusted not to exploit or to squander public goods. So I think there is still something there. The second thing is that it paints for a very, suppose you're right, that this if we subject everyone to this, that it is compatible with some picture of relational egalitarianism, then, and this is not much of a reply, more of a kind of vibe-based argument, that it makes for a very grim picture of the kind of egalitarianism that we're committed to, that it is a picture in which we are equals to the extent that we can't trust each other equally, and that we will organize our social lives on the basis that we cannot trust each other, and that this permeates across society. So I think that the sense is, if this is the egalitarianism that we want, then I don't want it. I'm not sure what else I want, but I don't want that. Yeah.
Great, thank you both so much. Can we please thank our speakers?